So welcome, colleagues, to the second of the three Ambitions Institute sponsored webinars led by Sir David Carter. The previous one was Developing People. I hope you've all had an opportunity to see that. And if you didn't, there is a link to the recording that you can catch up with it at a time of your leisure. Today is the theme is on the theme of accountability, and I should have added in the first at the start of the first webinar. These three sessions have come out of a citywide leadership audit around some of the identified areas for improvement or development in leadership across the city. So the three areas were developing people, on the theme of holding people effectively to account, and then finally the last one was about a vision and aligning that successfully through an organisation. So that's the background context. I'm delighted that David is with us again. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. Real pleasure to come and work with you again and to have an opportunity to share some of my thinking with you guys down in Plymouth. So that there is a really neat flow, I think, between the session I did a few weeks back on developing people and talking about accountability today. Because for me, they go very closely hand in hand. Accountability, yes, it's a process, but fundamentally, it's about the relationship between leaders and the people that work for that leader, and teams and how teams perform. And so accountability for me is something that really sits at the heart of our education sector. Arguably, it continues to exert too much downward pressure on the system. But that's not really the purpose of what I want to do with you this afternoon. What I really want to do today is to talk a little bit about how I think it works, and give you some tips about the kind of approaches that you can take to it. Recognizing that for those of you who are relatively new to leadership, or even if you have a degree of experience in this is still some of the conversations that we have in our professional lives that make our hearts beat a little bit quicker. And we have to get it right and get our messages over. And I'll talk a little bit about how I think that works as well. So if we go to the first slide, Tony, I can get started on this. I thought I'd start on the left-hand side of the screen here by talking about what is accountability. And I think the definition works something like this. It's the quality or state of being accountable, an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility for one's actions. So that definition is very much conceived from the point of view of the person who's being held to account, and the willingness that they embrace to be held to account for what they do. And I think it's really important that we talk about that, and we talk very much about how that works in terms of not just the set piece conversations that we might have once a term or 2 or 3 times a year, but actually every conversation that we have kind of has an element of accountability built into it. So I think it starts with yourself. I think it starts from where we are personally and where we are in terms of the roles that we play in our schools. And it's about being willing to show others that you welcome being held to account for these decisions and actions. It's not something to be done in secret. It's not something to be shy or afraid of. It's actually part of the quality of, and the integrity, I suppose, of being a leader, that we open ourselves up to that feedback. And that it's part of our function. It's not an add-on. It's not something that we prefer didn't happen. It's absolutely critical to us being successful. I think the second element is about clear expectations. And for this reason, and I'll come back to this a few times during the course of this talk, is the way in which you communicate is absolutely vital here. So the understanding is clear about 2 or 3 very precise things. First of all, what is it that you're expecting from me? What does good look like if I deliver the objectives that you've set me? And secondly, how are you going to judge me? How are you going to form a view about how well I've done? Is it simply about a set of data outcomes? Is it simply about a set of exam results? Or is there some softer and maybe some more intuitive indicators that you're looking for that are going to help you hold me to account and understand how well I've done my job? And I want to take that one stage further on the next slide. Again, I've repeated in the left-hand margin the definition. It's not the only definition of accountability, but if you're thinking about it or you're sharing it, that might give you a way into it. But the third element there is to create psychological safety. And what I mean by that is that team members, the people that you lead, or the teams that you're in and people are holding the team to account, have got to be able to speak openly and with honesty about the challenge and how they feel. And if you're interested in psychological safety as a concept, then look no further than Amy Edmondson, who's done some amazing work on this. And I've given you the web link there. There's a Harvard Business document she's written called How Fearless Organizations Succeed. And she talks about psychological safety there and what it is that leaders and team members respectively bring to creating psychologically safe teams. And I don't think unless you embrace some of this thinking about the environment that you create, I don't think you can create the kind of accountability culture that really drives standards forward over time. So have a look at that if that's of interest to you. And I think the fourth one is quite a personal one, really. It's about sharing priorities. I think it really helps if the team that you're working with and the people that you're holding to account really understand what you're being held to account for as well. So it doesn't exist in a vacuum that one person has a particular set of challenges and they keep them very, very close to themselves. They keep it in their file or they keep it on their iPad and nobody ever knows what it is. I think the ability to look at the team compilation of priorities means that actually when the team understands what the composite whole is trying to achieve, you get to a point quite quickly where actually people start to help each other out informally as well as formally. So I wanted to start with those four kind of statements about starting with yourself, thinking about psychological safety, great communication, and sharing the priorities. So if I go on one stage from that, let's just think for a moment about what it is in the kind of bigger picture sense that we are accountable for. And I've deliberately just focused this around, as you'll see on the left-hand side, as educationalists. And I think this probably would be fairly true of a number of public sector and probably some private sector organizations as well. But fundamentally, these are the things that I think we are accountable for. The first one is about spending taxpayers' money to advance education for public benefit. That's really important, I think. And in the maelstrom of a busy day in school, you won't be thinking about this. But fundamentally, everything that we pay for through education comes from the taxpayer. And that's a really important responsibility, and particularly for head teachers and for trust leaders. And I've always got in mind here the taxpayers who have children in the school sector at the moment, the taxpayers whose children are no longer in the school sector but still pay for it, and the taxpayers who don't have children. And that's why people are interested and motivated to find out how effective our education system is. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why, in spite of what we might debate inside the education system about the benefits and the challenges of Ofsted, it's one of the reasons why when you survey people outside of education, parents and other families who are not necessarily connected to our world, Ofsted gets a really high percentage satisfaction score because people like to know what they're being held to account for. The second one is about ensuring children are safe and cared for. That's a really important responsibility. And that's something that every one of us in the sector, every day that we go to work, has got to be mindful of. And I put that one higher up the list than improving standards, which is obviously another element of accountability. Because if children can't function in a culture where they believe an adult is looking out for them and where they feel safe, and where if something happens to them, either in school or out school, they've got an adult they can talk to, you won't improve standards. I think the other accountabilities, the three below, are slightly softer, but I still think they're relevant to the debate and to the argument. The fourth one is about transitional pathways for children as they get older. This, for me, is about speaking to the wider purpose of why education is important, because the purpose of education isn't simply about GCSE results and A-level results and Key Stage 2 results. It's not about that. That's an outcome of what we do. One of the things that we are accountable for is to make sure that every child who leaves school at 18 or 19 years of age does two things. First of all, they've got a pathway about where they go next, and we have to prepare them for that and help them. And the second one is that we have to create a sense in that young adult that education is just beginning when they leave school, not ending. So if they go into university, or they go into further education, or into apprenticeships, or into the world of work, this desire to continually to want to better yourself and develop new skills and knowledge, if we drive that out of kids, then actually they will be disadvantaged when they become adults themselves. The fifth one is about how we employ people and doing this really well in development and helping people become, as I think I might mention in the first session we did, the best professional versions of themselves. And then the last one, I think we are accountable for sharing with the wider system what we got right. We're not good at that in the education system. One of the things that motivates me to want to work with you guys in Plymouth is I think there is a real hunger to try to understand what's going on and what works in your schools. But not enough people think that. And so I think there is an accountability part of this, that when success happens, that we reflect on it and we share it to understand what it was that we did. So let me move on from there now and talk about what we know about accountability on the next slide. And this is getting into some of the slightly harder edge stuff, I suppose. So normally, as I say in my first bullet, accountability is top down. It was somebody who holds a more junior person to account for a strategy or improvement they've been asked to deliver. Now that just might be, we need you to be a consistently good teacher. And that's your contribution to this. But it might well be about a piece of curriculum innovation. It might be about a new way of thinking about assessment. It might be about leading training. But it tends to be generically a top-down model. Somebody more senior than us holds us to account. But I think really, really one of the most important elements of this is that there should be a dual sense of responsibility here, that the senior person who is holding you to account, or where you're holding somebody else to account, should also be accountable for making sure that that person has everything they need to be successful. Simply setting targets with them and reviewing them periodically is not enough, in my view. You've got to ensure that person who's being challenged to become a better teacher, or to take over a school a subject department that's not working particularly well, or to be responsible for perhaps a phase in primary education. You've got to make sure they've got the training, the development, the resources, the capacity to do that job. And if the line manager doesn't go into that particular space and have those conversations, then I think it can be quite a lonely place. And accountability then is something that's done to me rather than we're doing it together. I just want to make reference to Matthew Said's book called Black Box Thinking, which I'm sure some of you will have seen. I'm just holding up the book there in the camera. There's a really brilliant opening chapter on this. Chapter number 1 is called A Routine Operation. And it's quite a sad story. It's about a young mother who was going into hospital for a routine operation and died under the anaesthetic. And to cut to the chase, the story was that specialist doctors and surgeons all tried to save her, but the one person who knew what was going wrong and could have done something was the nurse who was in the theatre at the time. But the culture of the hospital didn't enable her to speak up to people in authority, and didn't enable her to tell the surgeons what was happening and what they should do about it, because she'd seen it happen before. And if the culture is so top down, the junior members of staff can't speak truth to power, which is a popular phrase that we use from time to time, then accountability becomes quite difficult. And so Matthew Said's book is a really good illustration of some of that. And there's lots of examples of if you know that book. Accountability, the third point I want to make the link with data here. There's a danger sometimes that we wrap data around the accountability conversation almost to give a bit of a shield of protection to some of the harder messages that we want to deliver. And I've always believed that data is used to start a conversation. It's not the conversation in itself. And so it's important to have some metrics, I think, to be able to refer to about the state of play with regard to what you're reviewing. But it can't simply be about data. In the same way, it can't simply be about exam outcomes in terms of how are we getting the best from this person. And then my final point is one I made when we talked about the developing people model for in the first session, that there is something here about how accountability relates to the culture of the school and the culture of the trust that you work in. So yes, it's a process. Yes, there is a schedule of activities that one does to deliver accountability, but it's fundamentally about the culture rooted in the organizations that we work in. So if I take it on one stage further, I just want to make that point a little bit more directly about how I think accountability has more value and meaning if it's associated with values and a code of moral purpose. And for that, I just want to borrow this slide, which if you were with me on the first session, you'll have seen. But it's one of the reasons why I use this slide, because I think it is a really useful fundamental base to most of the conversations that we have in school improvement and in school leadership. Because if you think about the relationship between accountability and improvement, that says a great deal about the values of the organization and how we do it. So that reminding about the mission and the vision that I talked about when we first met, about why the organization exists, what your DNA is, what the really important priorities are, and what the destination of your ambition is. I think the accountability conversation starts by revisiting that. So I think the illustration I gave you on the first session was, that the mission that we developed in the Cabot Learning Federation was to be the champion of vulnerable children, which was absolutely right for where we were in Bristol at that time, probably still is. So the accountability conversation starts with the contribution that individuals make to that mission, to that ambition. Not that it's solely about that, and the only conversation we have is about disadvantage or closing the gap. But if the mission of the organization that employs us is to do something extraordinary with disadvantaged kids, then accountability should be seeking to really drive forward upon that. And then that point at the top of the pyramid about the behaviors that underpin the culture and the values, that's really important. I think I'll probably talk to you about that pivot between the way that adults talk to adults, adults talking to children, and children talking to children as being a really clear definition of how cultures live and breathe in schools. But in this particular example, it's the relationship between adults talking to each other that is so important around the values. Because if you go into the accountability conversation and you are nervous about the reaction of the person that you're going to talk to and how they're going to respond, because you're not clear yourself about what the message is that you want to deliver, it's probably going to go wrong. And if you're on the receiving end of somebody holding you to account, who is kind of half looking out the window, half looking at their watch, just checking their phone for emails because a ping has come in, then you haven't got their undivided attention. So the way that we behave in the accountability setting is a really important representation for me about how the culture of the school works. So if I go on to the next slide, accountability is about asking great questions. I've got no doubt about that, and the questions I'm going to suggest that you go with have to be flexed, I guess, around the conversation that you're having and the content of what it is you want to talk about. But if I think back to my time, both as a CEO, but also as a commissioner, these were some of the questions that I used quite generically with head teachers and senior leaders in schools when I used to go and visit them. And I think they're questions that are by definition pretty open, because if you start your accountability conversations with questions that are closed, it becomes a bit of a cul-de-sac very quickly. So the first question that I used to ask was, how effective is the curriculum that you've designed, and what are the intended outcomes you're looking to achieve? So if we think about curriculum design at the moment, I mean, this time a year ago, or maybe 18 months ago, as the new Ofsted framework was coming into schools, there was a huge amount of work going on around the system around curriculum design. But you have to be able to answer that question about whether what you plan to do is working, and is it truly effective? And if you ask that question about the curriculum intent, the second question then about how well is it taught and what is your approach to tackling weak teaching suddenly becomes more relevant. If you simply ask what is your approach to tackling weak teaching as an accountability conversation with a member of your team, what you end up with is a conversation that's purely and simply about teaching the abstract. It doesn't relate to the curriculum content that's being delivered. My third question flows out of the first two, which is, what evidence do you have that children are making good progress? And again, I would urge you, if you ask that question, not to just simply look at progress data, as important as that is, but use the progress data as the start of the conversation. Look at the other evidence. Do people bring, for example, to your accountability conversations, examples of children's work? Do they bring examples of feedback that you've given to children and how they responded to that? Examples of pieces of work that you assessed that was then maybe redone and improved as a result of it? What student groups in somebody's classroom or in someone's department or team are making the least progress, and why do you think this might be? How well do children behave in lessons, and how effective is the support you have been given, both in terms of you and your team? And that last question is the link back to the one I showed you before about turning it round to the person who's the line manager and saying, what contribution have you made to making me a better teacher or a better middle leader? So how effective is the support that I, as the person being held to account, have been given in order to do my job more clearly? If I go a bit deeper on that with the next slide, on the school improvement topic, there are a number of questions I think you can ask about school improvement, and I think a number of the questions depend a little bit about where people are in terms of the trajectory of improvement, whether they're they're leading a team or a school that's in trouble, that's struggling, or whether it's a school that's good and coasting a little bit, or it's a school that's flying and is consistently very strong. But these are the opening questions, I think, before you get into the detail, before you start driving down into the absolute minutiae of what needs to improve. These are good questions to start the accountability conversation. So number one talks about, do we understand the depth of challenge we're facing to raise standards? You'll see in that one, I'm talking about we, not you. Because if we're talking about school improvement, this isn't just the responsibility of one person to improve the school. This is your contribution to a corporate collegiate attempt to make things better. So when I say, do we understand the depth of the challenge we're facing, I mean the school and your contribution to that particular bit. So if the school is really struggling with Key Stage 2 performance or GCSE performance, and I'm the head of science, it helps me as a head of science to understand the bigger picture of what the school is trying to achieve and what the challenges are that the school faces, as well as the challenges I face in science, and how my incremental improvement of science enables the school or the trust to incrementally improve as well. The second one is what are those data metrics that will help you to measure improvement? I think that's quite an important question because there are so many, which are the ones we're going to really talk about. Which pockets of practice are ready to be built upon first? So if let's imagine you're a newly appointed assistant principal and your brief is broadly teaching and learning, which is a pretty huge job. There will be pockets of practice in the school or across the trust that you're working in that you know are really strong. And you need to identify that quickly so you can not only maintain that strength, but you can use some of that strength to help the weaker areas that you're exposing. Really important question, that one. The fourth one is about your team, I suppose, and the degree to which the people in the team have a reality check, really, about the scale of the challenge and how ready they are to deliver change. I've heard so many times in my career people talk about a school that's been in difficulty for a long, long time, and saying, what can you expect from children in this community? They find education difficult. Their parents found it difficult. These are just excuses. How do we challenge that? How do we challenge the orthodoxy that says change can't happen? And what's the readiness of the team to do that? Just because you're leading change really well or powerfully or assertively doesn't mean that the team are with you. You have to have the conversation with the team about their position in terms of this and their recognition that things have got to get better. And the fifth one is linked into that, which is what external support do you need to deliver the improvement? So if you're a middle leader or an assistant head, as I alluded to a moment ago, do you have everything that you need? Has your career equipped you to meet every challenge that this job presents? I would argue no, it probably doesn't, because I think in every job I've ever done, I would have said the same thing. You're about 70 to 80% ready to do most jobs. And the other bit of learning that closes the gap to 90 or 95% you learn on the job. So where are you going to get the external support to enable you to be able to deliver the things that you're accountable for, but also to help your team deliver what they're accountable for? And then personally, you as an individual, as a leader, what are you prioritizing? What are your major concerns that you need to address first? Both either in your own leadership, but also in terms of the day-to-day practice that's unfolding in front of your eyes. So if you think about those questions on those slides, this one and the last one that started with the question about curriculum, they are good ones to use to practice on. And I think if you're nervous about the accountability conversation, or it's something that you haven't had a lot of experience of, having the opportunity to practice this, I'm hesitating to use the dreaded phrase role play, but I think the opportunity to rehearse it with a colleague, maybe somebody at the same level as you who's got the same challenges, to ask the kind of questions I'm proposing here and get your colleague to maybe attempt to answer them or switch it around and get them to ask you, just gives you a feeling of what it's like to hear the question spoken by somebody else rather than just have it in your own head. So don't be afraid to think about how you might do that. And then the last couple of slides, I suppose I'll sum this up. So I think it's important to say what happens when accountability goes wrong, and it does go wrong, and it's not the end of the world if it does, but you then have to fix it. And these are some of the things that I've seen happen in the school sector in the last sort of 20 years or so, that at a school and a trust level make accountability very difficult. So if improvement is measured by anecdote and personality, that's not accountability. And what it leads to is a real mistrust. So what I mean by that is, if people are swayed by the last conversation that they had, or the last lesson that they saw, or the last fleeting glance through a classroom window of something that was happening in a lesson, and that helps them form an opinion that must be true of everybody's practice, you have a very weak base in which to hold people to account. The second reason why it sometimes fails is that people, this is the silver bullet analogy. This is where people are throwing the kitchen sink at school improvement. And just as we got what used to one set of priorities, here comes another. And so the ground shifts too frequently and people can't keep up with the speed of change. And they haven't addressed the last challenge they were set that they were being held to account for before a new one has arrived upon them. The third one is that point about communication. I said earlier that the individual just doesn't understand what's expected of them. It's very hazy, and they're used to seeing performance management as being done to them rather than a professional conversation. And I think we're better at that now than we've been in recent times, but we were absolutely in that space in the past. The fourth one, and this definitely is still a reality, that the fear of sanction overtakes the opportunity to be innovative. So risk is overtaken by compliance. And it leads to the fear that if I do something that you don't understand or don't like, you will take a negative view of my performance. So that's a really important point about the culture in the organizations. The fifth one is Ofsted wants. Two words that absolutely are the death knell to school improvement in this country. Every conversation is seen through the lens of the next Ofsted inspection. We have to stop doing that. We have to be thinking about the needs of the communities and the children that we serve. And if we get that right, and we can answer those questions about curriculum, and we can answer the questions about weak teaching, and we can think about how we're challenging and improving school improvement, Ofsted will take care of itself. But we shouldn't be thinking about accountability just to make ourselves look good in the eyes of an inspector who spends a day and a half and about half an hour asking those questions. And the last one, I think, is a really important one, which is kind of what kind of both excites me and makes me nervous about accountability, which is people's lack of faith in their line manager, because they don't see that there's consistency about this. What I mean is the line manager who holds me to account does it really rigorously, and probably to a point at which I feel quite stifled by it, yet I know that they're not being held to account by the head teacher. So how do we build that culture and awareness that everybody is held to account, and it's not just top down, but it's bottom up as well? So when we think about and we're aware of those factors, it helps you anticipate the challenges that you probably want to avoid. And then to finish with, let's flip it around and talk about what happens when it does work well, and basically how do we summarize some of the things I've said to you this afternoon. So at its best, accountability working well sees some of the following things. The leaders in the schools and the trust are explicit in their communication of what they expect. Not just what they expect of the organization, but you personally. What is your contribution at this moment in time to making the team, the school, the trust better in terms of outcomes for young people and increasing their life chances? So that explicit nature of what it is you want me to do is really important. And if you're being held to account, never be afraid to go back and ask for clarification of it. And if you are leading somebody else through this conversation, always check in that they understand. And is there anything that you've said that that wasn't clear? Because if you haven't got that baseline, it'll be difficult. The dialogue between the team being held to account and those forming judgments about performance is exactly what I've said. It's a dialogue. It's not a set of expectations in the please do this now box. This is a dialogue about the challenges and how we're going to overcome this. And that's where you have a conversation about the support that you need to deliver the work. The difference between being accountable and being responsible is understood by teams and their line managers. They are different. Accountability is the particular aspect of the improvement journey that you and your team are uniquely held to account for. Being responsible is the degree to which we accept the responsibility to fulfill that obligation. So it's not just about accepting that accountability goes with the territory and it's part of our job. It's actually willingly accepting the responsibility to be held to account and to hold other people. I like indicators of success that are short, medium, and long term. The idea that we can just set a set of expectations that we'll look at in 12 months' time and never go back to them ever again is nonsense. The accountability conversations are part of a 5-year plan. And that's why I like the idea that they happen frequently, a little and often. So looking at success factors, both in terms of a term's length, which is just what I'm thinking about with short, medium term length, which might be 100 days over the course of 2 half terms, and the long term, the whole academic year, means that you get a chance to catch the progress in action. And then the final point is about this culture of shared accountability is embedded in the best practice. And there's a really good understanding of the difference between macro accountability and micro accountability. Loosely, what I mean by that is the improvement of the whole school. My personal contribution to making our school better is the macro accountability, and the micro is the contribution I make within my team. And it works on both levels. And it's as simple as this. If I'm leading a team of Key Stage 2 teachers in my school or in my trust, and we want our Key Stage 2 outcomes to improve, I am working in the macro space. But the detail that I go through with each individual teacher in my school to help them become a better teacher, to train them better, to coach them better, that's the micro accountability piece. And I think when I've seen that work really effectively, those are some of the features that I think embed the most successful accountability models in our sector. So look, I'll pause there. There's a lot to take on board. Please take the slides away. Please use them. Practice those questions that I've posed. And I hope that was helpful. And I'll hand back to Tony now.
So thank you. Really, really enjoyed that. Really thought-provoking presentation. Rich with experience, I think, David, and I think the way you connect some of that theory to your own experiences is hugely powerful. I've got just a couple of questions, really. I mean, in your view, you know, I typically come across these conversations in schools that actually leaders find these conversations hard. Yeah. You know, why do you think is it a sector thing? But why do you think people just find this work challenging and hard?
Yeah, I do think it's hard, and I think it's hard when you're new to it. But I don't think it gets that much easier when you've done it for many years. Because I think the moment you think you've got those conversations pinned down and you think you're good at them, is the moment one of them goes wrong, and then you have to reappraise everything that you've done. So, yeah, I do think they're hard, and I think part of it is important to say that it is, and that's why I think in the slideshow, looking at some of those questions gives you a chance to prepare and rehearse for it. But I think the reason it's hard is that fundamentally we don't like telling people bad news. That's at the heart of this. You know, we come into education to do good, and we come into education to make people feel positive and make a difference. But actually, part of leadership is about challenging performance that's not good enough. Not good enough if it was my child in the classroom or your child in the classroom. Not good enough because the children next door were timetabled to work with that teacher, and as opposed to children that just by the quirk of the timetable got this teacher. And every time they are taught by that person, they fall further behind than the class next door. So there's an equitability about this, which says it's really important you get this right, but you can't shirk the responsibility. It's part of the responsibility of being a leader, I think. And I think the more human element is that you don't know what the reaction is going to be. I think that's the element. And I think, in my experience, there are 3 reactions to the hard conversation, as we're terming it. There is no doubt in some people's cases that they find relief in it. No question about it. You know, they know they're in trouble. They know they're struggling, but they've been afraid to name it. They've been afraid to ask for help because they're worried it'll portray them as a weak individual. But actually, there's a real sense of relief. And sometimes once it's out in the open, we can do something about it. So there's definitely occasions I've had conversations where people have welcomed the feedback and the honesty of it. I think there's also some examples where people respond in exactly the way we'd hope that they would do. They're very businesslike about it. They accept the criticism and the feedback, and they want to do something about it tomorrow. Two challenges are: one is, are those just great words to keep you happy in the meeting, and actually they don't do anything as a result of it? Or secondly, do they go at it like a bull in a china shop and actually start behaving in a very erratic manner just to try to overcome the weakness that you discussed? But nevertheless, that's a reaction. And the third one is there's an emotional reaction. People get cross, they get angry, and maybe not in the meeting, but they'll go away and reflect on it. They'll think about it and they'll come back and they'll want to talk to you about it again. And that's fine. It's good that they do that. But that's why a couple of the points I made earlier on are so important here. One is about the clarity of the message. If people don't understand really simply what it is that you want them to know, then the danger is that the complexity will open up the vagueness and they'll be concerned about they don't understand. So I'd even go as far as writing down in a couple of sentences exactly what it is you want to say to them. And whenever they come back and say, well, I don't agree with you, or what do you mean by that? Just use the same words again. Don't try to find another set of words to make it sound easier, because the chances are you're going to make it more clunky. So that ability to be really clear about what you're communicating. If that conversation is in danger of breaking down because somebody is really upset or they're very angry, pause the conversation, end it, but schedule it to happen the next day so people have a chance to reflect on it. But what you can't do when you're delivering that tough message is you can't suddenly say, oh, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Yeah, it's me. No, you're okay. Because at that point you're finished. You've got no credibility left. So being able to pause the conversation and come back to it if you need to. And similarly, if the meeting ends well, and even though people are upset, make sure you talk to them the next day as well. Make sure you touch base with them to check how they're feeling about that. Because my experience is that if you get the culture of that relationship right, and people trust you as their line manager, or you trust the person that's line managing you, you can accept the degree of difficult feedback because you know it's coming from a good place. If you don't have that trust, and you have your suspicions about the motives of how that message was delivered, then you'll never build the trust. So I think the emotional reaction is part of that. And I think that just by calling it out and saying what it is sometimes makes it easier.
I guess, as we tie this up, let's try and be really pithy about how leaders prepare for these conversations. I think one of the messages you've given really, really soundly is the precision of the issue that you want to discuss, the language that you're using, and the fact that you reinforce that and don't divert from that. Are there any other thing? It feels like preparation is key for these meetings.
Definitely.
What would be your advice?
Okay, I can do this quite succinctly. I think there's 4 stages to this. I think plan is the first one, for all the reasons we said. Don't plan 50 meters from the door of the meeting. Give yourself time to think about this and get the preparation done. Rehearse it, either just in the car driving to school, or in the shower, or going for a run. Just rehearse it. If you can rehearse it with somebody else, that's great. But I think you have to rehearse it so it doesn't sound cold coming out of your mouth. At the end of the conversation, summarize it. Make sure everybody's heard the same message, and then that check-in bit. Check is my 4th one. Check that people have understood what you said. If not in the meeting, certainly in the next couple of days. And then I think you have a way forward. And I think part of the checking in is to write it down, whether it's in an email or it's just in a note, but people have a record of the meeting. That's very important. If you're in a situation where it goes really badly wrong and all of a sudden you're having to have a conversation with the union rep as well as the individual, it doesn't half help if you've got an annotation of the meeting and evidence that you gave the person a copy of that. If they then turn around to their union rep and say, well, they said that, but they never told me, they never put it in writing, you're in a difficult place. So that check bit at the very end is the full stop on that particular conversation.
Okay, that's fantastic advice. I really enjoyed the Developing People webinar, but I really, really enjoyed this one. I thought it was really excellent, and it's got me thinking so much around all the formal and informal conversations actually that occur in the life and day of a school that you've shone a light on. So we thank you very, very much indeed. We look forward to, we hope you have a happy Christmas.
Yeah.
First, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year on January the 12th, where we talk about vision and alignment.
Thanks, Tony, and good luck to everybody. Have a happy Christmas, everyone.